Hello and welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast. I'm Joost, your coach over at Pace Buddies, and today I'm joined by Marco Altini, founder of HRV for training and advisor at Oura. His background is in computer science and engineering. He started building some of the first prototypes of wearables, and years later he went back to university to study sports science because he wanted to understand the bodies he was measuring. These days he also coaches endurance athletes and trains for ultras himself. Heart rate variability is something that we see everywhere nowadays. Every ring watch can measure it. But what does that number actually tells us? How do we interpret it? Well, Marco built one of those tools, and he's the best person to ask those questions. So let's go and have our chat with Marco Altini. Hello, Marco, and welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast.
Hey, Jos, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming. But maybe before we start diving into HRV, maybe you can tell something about yourself. How did you become active in physiology and HRV especially?
Yeah, for sure. Well, my background is actually in computer science and engineering. So I started from a bit of a different path. And then I would say almost by chance, I wasn't really finding something that would pique my interest, let's say, or get me particularly excited about what I was studying until I ended up doing some studies on what we used to call embedded systems, sensors placed either on the body or the environment. Now we call them wearables when we wear them on the body. But it was early prototypes, maybe 20 years ago. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. You can measure things from the body and, use the skills I had as a computer scientist and as an engineer to maybe try to capture, high quality data and interpret it and do something useful for people. That was not just maybe, design a website or something like that, even though nothing wrong with that, but still it wasn't something that would motivate me so much. So I ended up in the Netherlands actually and doing some kind of work with early prototypes of wearables. And in particular, I started working with sensors that could measure the activity of the heart and movement. And from that, of course, it's a short step to get into heart rate and heart rate variability and what that means in the context of daily stresses and health and performance. And that's a bit how it started. And many years later, I actually ended up studying also sports science because my interest went that way. And so I wanted basically to complement my background and understand a bit better also the physiology of things. And since then, I think I tried to play this role, so to speak, in which I try to combine the technology and the physiology and make it accessible to people, either developing tools like HRV for training, the app I built to track HRV, but also just advising other companies or helping out in some university courses and things like that. So that was a big part of the process. Right now, I'm also an endurance coach like you for runners, something I started a few years back. Again, I would say I found that this was really what started to motivate me more in these late years, more than the technology itself. So maybe using the technology for something useful more than developing it, which was something that was driving me more in the past. So it's been a bit of a shift. But yeah, I'm enjoying, I would say, the new path as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really passionate in bridging the science to everyday runners like
I
us.
try.
Yeah, exactly. Is that one of the reasons why you started HRV for training?
Yeah, for sure. I would say also myself, I did always sports as a kid, but it was typically, team sports or things like that. And then when I went to university, and actually when I left the country, I left Italy the first time to move to the Netherlands and I came here and, I was pouring myself into work and it was work, Monday to Sunday, nothing else. And then, there's, it's of course somewhat stressful. And I started running maybe as a stress release. And then one thing leads to another, and now I train for ultra marathons. Got out of hand probably, but that's a bit how it started. Also the passion with that, and since I was doing that type of work, and I was also, experiencing various stresses myself professionally, but also starting something new like training. I think that was a big motivation to self-experiment and build tools that would track my response to all of these things, like before training and looking at heart rate variability as a stress marker, as well as just heart rate during exercise as a marker of changes in cardiorespiratory fitness and all these things, which, especially when you begin and you go from not doing anything endurance related to becoming, so to speak, a recreational endurance athlete, then those changes are more marked. So it's also easier to capture them. And that, I think, was part of what interested in looking into these things.
Yeah. It's a great story. It's how we all start. It's first a 5K, and before you know it, it's a 50K.
Certainly.
Yeah, brilliant. Before we start diving into HRV, maybe we should set the basis first. What is HRV and what is it measuring? Before we continue, if this conversation is resonating with you, chances are you're the kind of runner who wants to train smarter and not harder. That's exactly who I work with at Pace Buddies. I coach recreational runners to achieve their personal best, who are serious about building real aerobic fitness. The kind of fitness that actually shows up on race day. So if you're looking for one-on-one personalized coaching, head over to pacebuddies.com and book a 30-minute free consultation call with me.
Yeah. So we mentioned it a few times, but basically HRV in practical terms, I think we can think of it, if we measure it under certain circumstances, and we get to that later, is basically a proxy of our stress response. So we all experience stressors. That could be, again, work, it could be training, could be, other life events. We experience stressors, and when we do so, something happens in our body, right? So the autonomic nervous system responds to that. There are also hormonal changes that we cannot capture so easily, but something that we can capture is how the activity of the heart changes because of the autonomic nervous system response. We face a stressor, the nervous system as a response that impacts heart rhythm. For example, I think people are familiar with simply feeling stressed and feeling that their heart rate is racing or increasing, right? So that is, again, it's a nervous system response. Together with that, it happens that heart rate not only increases, but its variability, so the changes between consecutive beats, reduces. So that is heart rate variability. Over a period of time, we look at the variation between heartbeats and we quantify that. That is a bit more complex, mathematically speaking, than looking at just the average time between heartbeats, which would be heart rate, right?
Mhm.
But the relationship is inverse typically between the two, right? So we are more stressed, heart rate increases and HRV reduces. And the opposite, typically when we are less stressed or recovering from stress, heart rate reduces and HRV increases. So by looking at HRV, we get basically an indirect view of how our body is responding to stressors. And that can be useful, of course, for a number of things, even just trying to understand how we are doing in the context of the stressors that we face, but also potentially making changes to things that we do in life so that our stress response also improves and we don't dig a hole, right? Because we could go into burnout professionally or into overtraining in the context of training. So there's all sort of chronic negative stress responses that we want to avoid, and keeping track of HRV could be a tool to better manage stress in that context.
Yeah. We might think that the heart is like a metronome, it just beats very precise, but it's not. And how more relaxed we are, how higher our HRV and how more the variation in beats is. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's sometimes maybe counterintuitive, but indeed we don't expect heart rate to be right perfectly constant as a metronome, as you said, but there is always some variability, and actually that variability is typically a good thing, and a bit higher variability tends to be associated in relative changes to higher parasympathetic activity, so the activity of the nervous system related to rest and relaxation, which indeed is a good thing if we're trying to recover from a hard effort or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And in that rest mode, our bodies are able to adapt to the training we're giving it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. Well, perfect. Now we know what HRV is because we all seen it. There are dozens
It's
of
everywhere
wearables.
now.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe we can start with what are some of the misconceptions you came across with HRV, because it is everywhere, but there's also a lot of noise on social media, on our internet about
Yeah,
HRV.
for sure. Yeah, I think one of the main ones probably is that it needs to be higher, right? The highest possible. Higher is better. This is quite common as messaging. Many of the tools available also still interpret the data that way. I think that is a bit naive and it's not necessarily how physiology works. And in general, my recommendation to get in the right mindset with this kind of tools is to understand that there is large individual variation, so every person is different. The first thing to remember is that we shouldn't really be comparing with other people because the values that we see are also tightly coupled with our genetics. And so it could be that what is normal for us is not normal for our friend, and that is fine. We both have the ability to perform very well. And, the one with the HRV could actually be, in absolute term, performing better, running faster or whatever. It's just not a direct link to our performance ability or anything like that. HRV becomes useful typically when we look at it in relative terms, meaning how it changes for me based on what is normal for me. So if it is reduced, then we understand that there is more stress on the body and we haven't bounced back to our normal. And so we might want to take care of that. But that is a relative change. It's not really about the absolute number that our HRV is. So it's important to understand the difference between people and also the fact that coming back to higher is not necessarily better. Our physiology doesn't really work that way. And I think people can relate to many other signals like blood glucose or blood pressure, all sorts of things that we know have an optimal range. And HRV also has that optimal range. So it's not that it needs to be always high. High blood pressure is as bad as low blood pressure, right? So we want to things to be quite normal, right? And there is variability during the day depending on the things that we do and activity and stress and so on. And when we measure at resting conditions, we want things typically to be stable within an optimal range. And the main difference between HRV and these other signals is that HRV is very individual. So this optimal range is something that needs to be established for you as you take measurements with your device or you measure passively with a wearable and whatever system you use. After a few days, it should be possible to determine what is normal for you and to capture deviations from that. And that is what is useful. And typically when physiology is normal, it's a good thing. We bounce back. When it's abnormal, either particularly high or particularly low, then it's more of a warning sign and something we want to pay attention to. So I would say that that's typically the biggest misconception, really. The higher is better, which is, you have to increase your HRV and those sort of things. I think that is not really how we should be using this data necessarily, especially if we are already people that are relatively healthy, right? If there is room for improvement in your health, then for sure make changes. But otherwise, I think it's not the outcome you want to think of in that way in terms of increases in the metric. It's more about how to keep it stable, which means that your body recovers from the stressors that you face. Maybe a second misconception is that HRV would determine your ability to perform on a given day. So if it's slow, people get concerned that maybe they cannot race or they cannot do a hard workout, or if it is low and they manage to do the hard workout, then they would think that maybe the signal is not useful. But it's not how we should interpret it. So it's not about what we can do unless, we are sick. And of course, if there is a health issue, right, the data will be low and we will be feeling poorly. But otherwise, the signal is more of a representation of our capacity to assimilate stress more than it is a representation of our ability to perform. So if we have a low HRV, we still can train hard or can still, of course, race. But if we are training and the race is still far, then it simply might not be the ideal time to train hard, because that stressor is more unlikely to be assimilated well because the body is already stressed. There's not enough moment in which it can assimilate well the stressor and respond positively. And so that is really what the data is telling us, that maybe it's not a good time to apply additional stress. We should try to bounce back first, more than telling us something about our ability to actually execute the session on that day.
Yeah. So with a low HRV, we could do a hard session, but our body may not adapt to it afterwards. So there isn't really, minimum returns in case of our training.
Exactly. I think that's what we've seen in a few studies that try to look at that systematically. So some people maybe at the end of the study train less hard in total because they lowered the intensity of the session when their HRV was suppressed. But then at the end of the study, they performed either equally well to the group training hard regardless of HRV or better. So performance could improve by training less hard because you apply the stimulus at the right time and you don't apply it if the body cannot respond positively. I think intuitively we all know that, not all days are the same. And some periods we seem to improve also faster, right? Maybe some training blocks we really feel like we are getting better, some training blocks not really. And, timing matters. And this can be a way to also manipulate the timing of the hard sessions.
Yeah, well said. Great explanation. And you said we have to know our baseline, our normal in HRV. How long a time do you need to track HRV before you have a baseline for yourself?
Yeah, I would say a couple of weeks would be good.
Mm-hmm.
We need also to keep in mind that our normal or our baseline, our normal range, whichever way we want to call it, changes over time. So it's not something that we shouldn't even stress about, because some people then stress about when should I measure it, right? Is it now it's the optimal time because maybe I'm training less, it's a good time, for me and not stressed, or maybe I shouldn't because I am actually stressed or training hard. None of that matters, because our normal is constantly changing. It changes because of, environmental factors, right? The seasons, longer days, shorter days, more light exposure, less, and all sorts of things, temperature changes. It changes because of our fitness changes. It changes because maybe our body weight changes. So all sorts of things drive small changes in our physiology. And as such, when we use a tool, this tool should be tracking and changing our normal range based on the past few weeks of data. For example, our app uses about 6 weeks of data. It will give you a normal range already the first week, but then it will keep building it for 6 weeks. And then as you keep measuring, it will keep updating with the last 6 weeks, because this normal range needs to stay current. We cannot just rely on all the data, because things change and that frame of reference would not be valid anymore. So you can start measuring anytime, but then keep in mind that a couple of weeks would be a good frame of reference to understand what is normal for you right now. And that will also change a bit over time.
Yeah. If I just look at myself, how I monitor my HRV, I'm looking at the past 42 days and
Yeah.
the past 7 days and see where it balances out. And then I can see, okay, today is a lower HRV day or a higher HRV day. But I mainly look at the 7 days against the 42 days. Is that a
That's
good
great.
principle?
Yeah, I think that's great, because we use the longer time window for what we call the normal range. So the 42 days, or, the 6 weeks or the 8 weeks, or whatever we use, for this time, for this reference, let's say. So we build this frame of reference that is the longer term view. And then we want to see right now, how are we doing with respect to that? And to do that, we can do it in different ways. We can look at today's HRV, or we can look at this week's average, the baseline, as you do. And I think both matter. For example, if we're getting sick, of course, that's something that the daily value will reflect better than the weekly average, because the weekly average is lagging a bit behind. But at the same time, the approach you're mentioning is also where the research has gone in the past years, right? At the very beginning, it was a bit more reactive. So it would use the daily value to decide if we were changing the training, adjusting the training. But again, that is a very reactive approach. And sometimes there are variations that are really not so relevant because of many different things, right? Maybe it was just a bad dinner that you had, or sleep wasn't great, right? All sorts of things that maybe are minor stressors, and the day after you are back to normal, and we don't want to be that reactive. So more recent research has actually decided to implement changes when the baseline or the weekly moving average, that, for example, the system that you're using, when that is outside of the normal range, then we also have a bit of a stronger evidence that there is a meaningful stressor that our body has not dealt with properly, because it's not just a single day to get the baseline outside of the normal range. It takes a couple of bad days. So we know there is something there. We are not processing well, some training related stressor or some other stressor. And so that is probably a very good time then to really make a change, because we have, again, stronger evidence that the body is not responding well to stress. So looking at it that way, baseline 7 days, and normal range, which could be 6 to 8 weeks, or maybe even 4 weeks for a shorter version. All of those, I think, are meaningful. And then we have our frame of reference to try to capture our response and to also make some changes.
Yeah. Because the difficult thing about HRV, if you look at just in the morning, is you don't know where your body is reacting to. It could be the hard session of yesterday, but as you told, it could also be the meal you ate, or the stress at work, or a bad night's sleep in heat.
Yeah, everything matters. I think that's one of the most important things also to remember, right? HRV is not about training. HRV is sensitive to all stressors, and it's not specific of anything. So if you see a suppression, obviously you are the person living those stressors, so you are the best equipped person to try to understand why, but the data itself will not tell you in any way why, right? So there's any stressor could be there, and sometimes we can figure it out. Sometimes it's a bit more subtle and difficult to capture, and maybe still worth listening to.
Yeah. And maybe there's what journaling might help. The
Right.
first thing we might think is our training, but if we journal a bit every day, we see, oh, my night's sleep wasn't perfect, or
Yeah.
maybe even for a week, and then we see the baseline dropping. Well, we know it's also because of our sleep.
Yeah.
It's more
Yeah.
factors. It's context.
Yeah, exactly. As you said, it's really the context, and that is really key to capture. It's also why I think it's good to use a tool that allows you to capture that context more than just to track passively, because otherwise it's easy to lose track of what drives changes.
Yeah. Yeah, and we run as well, me especially, I like data, and we might get absorbed with it, and we see little lines in HRV dropping, and then what is it? But we need to look at the whole picture, not just training and running, but our daily life stresses as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things I learned over the years was always that it was work to drive changes in my physiology and not training. And it is obvious if you think about it, right? I'm not a professional athlete, and work is, so to speak, where I had to perform, right? So that was where what I was stressed about. And, but still it's, I think, quite eye-opening sometimes to see it in the data, so you can slowly try to take action and try to keep things more in check. As your training builds up, I think there are certain situations also where the training will show in the data, but typically that is more a matter of also the intensity, the capacity to absorb a certain session. Because if everything goes well, even if you're an elite athlete training many, many hours, typically if you are training well, meaning you're doing what your body can absorb, what the capacity you have, even when you're pushing hard, then typically the data would be very stable. You would have very little suppressions and so on. It's more frequent to have those suppressions maybe for people that are actually maybe beginners and, go out for a hard session and overdo it a bit, and they're a bit overcooked, and that stays with them maybe 2 days instead of 10 hours, and you can see those kind of things also in the data.
And when we have a busy and stressful life, it's even maybe more difficult to measure what our ability to absorb the training is. I can imagine that maybe elites that training is their life. It's easier to filter out the noise in HRV and their ability to absorb the training that they do, because it's almost everything they do.
Yeah, exactly. And there's more time dedicated to recovery, and everything
Yeah.
is, thought in a way typically that you take care of, your everything that you're doing, so that things are quite stable physiologically speaking. And, for someone else that has a job and maybe travels frequently, or, there's all sort of things happening, we have also more fluctuations, more suppressions, and it's more difficult to understand if, shall we adjust a bit the training, or here is really, simply life is taking over so often that there is little you can do in terms of training manipulation if you don't address other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And another metric we see on our watches or rings is resting heart rate. How does that couple to heart rate variability?
So I would say, in general, resting heart rate and heart rate variability have a strong relationship. As we were saying at the beginning, one goes up, the other goes down, typically, but they are not exactly the same thing. So I think that is important to remember. Resting heart rate is also modulated by the nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So when we are at rest, it tends to be lower. When we are stressed or exercising, it gets quite a bit higher. The opposite of heart rate variability. Now, heart rate is also much simpler, right, to compute. Actually, we can do that without any technology, right? We can just count our pulse, so fantastic. But at the same time, the reason why we go through the trouble of looking at HRV is that it is a bit of a more sensitive metric. And that means that there are situations in which the stressors are a bit more subtle. So if we are sick, for sure, our heart rate will be very high with respect to our normal, and you can spot it without looking at other metrics. If we are going maybe at altitude and we are used to that, or we are increasing our training load a bit in terms of intensity or volume, or there is some non-training related stressor that is creeping in. Those kind of things that maybe don't show a change in heart rate or show minimal change, right? My heart rate maybe today is 1 beat higher than yesterday or 2. What does that mean? Because it's very small changes. Now, in HRV, these changes are more marked. So that is why we look at that. So we tend to see larger changes in response to certain stressors with respect to heart rate. And that makes HRV typically more useful, especially in the context of small changes for training-related purposes, because again, we are looking at maybe a period in which we are healthy and there's no major stressors that would be easily captured in heart rate data. So the higher sensitivity of HRV, I would say, is the reason why we look at that, even though I think both metrics should be what we look at in the morning, not just one or the other, because they can both complement each other in useful ways, right? So if our heart rate, for example, stays normal, but our HRV tends to be suppressed, I think that is a sign that maybe there is some stressors we are not dealing with correctly, but at the same time that we are still healthy. So I think that is a bit different with respect to when heart rate is also quite a bit elevated and maybe HRV suppressed. And then we are like, hey, maybe I'm actually getting sick. So those situations, I think, can be discriminated in a way by looking at both signals more effectively than just looking at one.
Yeah. And is there a best practice on how to measure HRV? Is that my watch does it during the night and gives an average of the entire night? I know your app HRV for training is in the morning when you wake up. Is there a best practice?
Yeah, so I would say there are two ways that are these two ways, morning or night, to capture our resting physiology in a way that is useful, even though the two ways differ in terms of what the data means. We can discuss that in a second, but it's important to understand that we need to measure our physiology at rest and when we are relatively far from stressors, and also that measuring our physiology outside of this context typically results in either artifacts, data that is not accurate because all sorts of things that we do also impact heart rate and heart rate variability in a way that is not representative of stress anymore. And I'm saying this because now devices measure HRV all the time and provide stress estimates. And I think we need to be very careful with those because there is all sorts of technological and physiological issues that make that data really not representative of stress anymore. About, we are talking or we are just maybe drinking some water or, swallowing saliva, like all sorts of the things that we do 1 million times per day impact also your physiology in a way that the link between the nervous system and measuring HRV as a proxy of stress breaks. And so that view is not useful, but if we measure it at rest, far from stressors, when all these artifacts are not present, and that would be either in time, first thing in the morning when we take care of taking a resting measurement, or during the night as we sleep, then outside of this context, I think that is not really particularly useful. But in this context, is a good snapshot of our resting physiology. And that said, the differences, I would say, between the two protocols are also important. For example, if we measure in the night, of course, the night comes before the morning. So the data captured in the night tends to be a bit more tightly coupled with our behavior, what we did the day before. And again, if our behavior is pretty standard across days, the night data tends also to be quite correlated with morning data. If our nights are a bit more eventful, we go out often or eat late or drink some alcohol here and there, then that will be reflected more in the night data because it takes some hours to the body to renormalize, of course. And as athletes, or if you use HRV to adjust the training, I think at that point, it's a bit more useful to measure in the morning, in particular because you are further away from those stressors. So if you measure in the morning, then you measure after the restorative effect of sleep that you can also see as a positive stressor. And then your data, I think, is more actionable for the day ahead. But again, this depends a bit also on behavior, how much behavior impacts the night data, right? For me personally, every day is pretty much the same, and night and morning data are very similar. Right, I measure in the morning with our app, but I also have, a typical GPS watch that now also records HRV, and the two data points are highly correlated. So this timing difference is also highly impacted, of course, by our behavior. And the other difference, I would say, is the protocol itself in terms of body position. Of course, when we are sleeping, we are lying down. So that is the only body position for that type of recording. When we are in the morning, we can also measure while sitting or even standing, which is often done in research to elicit the orthostatic stressor is called. It just means that you change body position and then your body needs to readjust quickly, right, in terms of changes in blood pressure and so on, right, because otherwise you would faint. So when you change body position, you have a short time in which the body readjusts. And if you measure shortly after, let's say within a minute that you've changed body position, then your measurement becomes even more sensitive to the stress response, because basically the response is amplified by the change in body position. So it happened to me, for example, in the past, I was measuring in both positions just to capture some data related to these responses. And I went through a period in which I was sick. And when I was lying down, my heart rate was just a bit elevated with respect to my healthy heart rate. But if I would sit up and measure, then basically it would just take longer for the body to respond to the challenge of changing position. Something as simple as changing position, still, if you're sick, it's just harder for the body to renormalize, and then heart rate will be maybe 10, 15 beats higher. So you see it more in terms of the response if you measure shortly after the change in body position. So that is what we typically recommend, especially to athletes or to people that are really interested in seeing how to use this data to make adjustments to their training, because it can be a bit more sensitive. There was a nice study also recently looking, for example, at changes in physiology when going at altitude for some athletes. I think people that probably were used to that kind of stimulus, given that in their night data, there was actually no change at all in their age, even at altitude. But then in the morning, they would measure standing up, and there you could see a large change with respect to sea level. So you needed the challenge basically to see the stressor, which otherwise in a very parasympathetic state, as when you are asleep, was not evident. I think that is also something interesting to explore for people that are maybe looking into this kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very interesting. That it's something as simple as body position affects our HRV so much. And you said that you measured both ways with your GPS watch and with the app. Are the data points the same, or are you looking at the changes?
Yeah, the relative changes, I think, are always what we look at, because the absolute values in this case can differ for various reasons. One is being asleep against being awake, so it's a different state, so there can be a difference there. And the other one is also body position, because in the morning I measure sitting, and in the night, of course, I'm lying down. So two differences also there. I have to say that despite this, my HRV data is rather similar between the two, while my heart rate, for example, shows the typical few beats higher when I'm sitting with respect to when I'm asleep, of course. But in terms of the relative changes, which I think is what matters and how we use this data, then they track very similar in my case.
Okay, oh, that's very interesting. And should we be worried about the accuracy of a wearable? Because when I'm going for a run, I'm using a heart rate strap or arm-based one or a chest strap, either one. Isn't a wearable accurate enough to record HRV? Should we worry about that?
Yeah, so I think that quite a few wearables are good at this stage, especially because we measure when nothing else is happening. So even the watches and wearables that maybe are not so good to record your heart rate when you exercise, it does not necessarily mean that they will not be good at measuring these metrics when you are asleep, because it's a very different situation. And what makes the data inaccurate is really movement. There's nothing else. So when there is no movement, those artifacts are not present, and it's much easier to process the data. Still, I would go for devices that have shown some level of validation. There's maybe someone bothered to compare them with a chest strap or a reference system and ECG, because there's like 1 million wearables now, right? So there's 1 million brands, so many different rings and bands and watches. So for sure, many of those are inaccurate. But if we look at the main brands, people have looked at their accuracy. That could be, the Whoop band, the Oura ring, which I'm also an advisor for, just for disclosure, but they're all very similar. And, the Garmin watches sometimes show some issues across certain values. But again, when you look at relative changes for your own data, they tend to be very similar. And the Chorus watches as well, that's what I have right now. And also I tested against ECG, and the values over time were very similar. So I think the main brands tend to be reliable for night snapshots. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I'm a Chorus user as well, so I don't have to worry.
No, that should be fine.
Thank you. Well, we've set the basis now, I think. Let's go to a runner. He has a schedule. He wakes up, he checks his HRV, resting heart rate. What's next? What should a runner do or an endurance athlete do with these numbers with respect to their plan?
Yeah, so what we've seen, I think the most consistently in research is that the one thing that really impacts autonomic activity and recovery is the intensity of the stimulus more than its duration, for example. So if we're going through a training block, our race is still, far away, so to speak. The best way to use the data is to make adjustments that would manipulate the training intensity. And in particular, if our HRV is outside of our normal range, too low, or I would say even too high, that is also what has been done in research, then we would lower the intensity of the stimulus. It just means it's not a great time to assimilate the stressor and to respond positively and to improve. And so in those situations, we can reduce the intensity. We would do that using the baseline or 7-day moving average. So if you have a suppression today and you feel great, you have a hard session, I would not change that. I would do the hard session and then you see what happens tomorrow, because maybe again, it was nothing. And then the day after, you are within the normal range despite the low value and the hard session. So nothing to worry about, nothing to change. But if you had a couple of bad days, the data is low for 3-4 days, the baseline is also below normal range, not only the daily value, and you have hard session, then it could be a good idea to actually do a lower intensity session. The research that has looked also at duration that is limited, but still has shown that, for example, a 2 hours effort with respect to a 1 hour effort, as long as they are both below our first threshold in a model, typical model with 3 zones and 2 thresholds, as long as you're below the first threshold, then that intensity we can consider it low, and that would not impact HRV and therefore your autonomic nervous system and recovery meaningfully. And so you don't necessarily need to shorten your training if you feel good, but lowering the intensity typically is a good idea. So I think that is the simplest and most meaningful thing that we can do, practically speaking, with this data.
Yeah. And after a hard session, I sometimes see that the following morning my HRV dips a bit. Is that normal, or is it a sign that we've done too much?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think in general, we would want not to see that. Because I say this because some people really see it as something they want to see, like as a proof that they train hard. I don't think that's how it works. Like if we can absorb the stressor well, like the best athletes have the fastest recoveries. This also has been shown in the same studies where you look at how HRV renormalizes after also a very hard effort, not only for an effort that is below the first threshold, but also an effort between thresholds or above the second threshold. And you would see that the fitter the athlete, the faster the renormalization, right? So if you don't renormalize in time, if anything, is a proof that your fitness is not good. So think about it that way, as opposed to that was very hard session. With that being said, we have suppressions also when we face new stressors, right? So sometimes maybe it's a new stimulus. Maybe you're introduced intensity after a long time, or you try to stress a different system or more prolonged intensity. Those situations, it's perfectly normal that the body takes some time to recover. And so if you see a suppression there, like you mentioned, that can be totally fine and totally normal. But when you reapply that stressor later, and then you reapply it again, you might want to see a change. So you don't want to see a suppression every time that you do that, but you would want to see that the body learns to respond faster and to renormalize faster, and that would be a good sign. And you're improving in absorbing that stressor. So I think that is how we can also use the data in that context. Like the suppression sometimes is not a problem, but then if we consistently have a suppression when we do something, then maybe that something is something that we should scale down a bit. Maybe it's a bit much for what our body can handle.
Yeah. Okay. That's so interesting. And we're talking about a normal range. Is that a single value, or is that a wider range that we're monitoring? And how, if it's a wider range, how wide a range is it?
Yeah, well, it is certainly a wider range. So it depends on the person, though. So also, what is normal for me is not only around a certain absolute value that is also linked to my genetics, which might differ from yours, but also the width, so how wide this range is, right? So the fluctuations within this range can be smaller or larger, depending also on genetics and our physiology and our behavior. So that is also not something that is the same for everyone. That is why it can only be built on your own data. So after a few weeks of exploiting, looking at the variability in your data, then you can establish this range, which will go, from a minimum to a maximum that we consider that is what is normal physiology for you. And typically you want to be within that, which doesn't mean that you're not experiencing stressors. But since we measure once per day, it just means that when you measure at rest, your body has bounced back to normal, because of course we all face stressors during the day.
Yeah, of course. So when we are viewing our HRV over a week, we see fluctuations. That's all normal. But what we want to watch out for are spikes within those fluctuations, spikes
Exactly.
up or down.
Yeah, changes that are larger than the normal range. A large suppression always means, I would say, there's a poor response to a stressor, while when the value is particularly high, I think that is a bit more up for debate. But I think the consensus right now is that it's not something to take as a positive on most occasions. And that's why we need to be, cautious with the higher is better kind of messaging.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's very interesting. What could be the case that HRV spikes up? Because if it's going down, it's maybe too much stress. And in my mind, exactly what you say. Well, if it's going up, it's better.
Yeah, exactly. So I think at times what we capture is actually that the parasympathetic system is overly active, not because you have recovered well, but because you are very busy recovering, so to speak. And you can see that also at the same time, you would have maybe a particularly low heart rate. And I think also as a coach, we are familiar with, for example, seeing, so one thing in the long term for an athlete, maybe their heart rate to lower at a certain external load, right? A certain pace, a sign of fitness as an athlete goes through improvements. But we also know that if today I go out for a run and my heart rate is 10 beats lower than yesterday's at the same pace, then we typically associate that to fatigue, not to, a very quick change in fitness, which would not be realistic. So that kind of change in fatigue, I think, is similar. Maybe the parasympathetic system is overly active, and then heart rate is suppressed. And that is also reflected in resting data in a way that heart rate could be particularly low and HRV could be particularly high. Maybe we are overreaching a bit. It's still okay, but if we keep doing that, maybe we really go into a negative chronic state. And so I think it's more of a warning sign when we have this abnormal change, even if it is in the typical good direction, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very, very helpful. So thank you. And I was also wondering what happens with HRV and resting heart rate in our taper, because when we're tapering for a race, the excitement for the race is coming, but also the nerves for the race. Does that influence HRV and resting heart rate as well? Did you see that in your data?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's maybe also another misconception. People expect their HRV to increase on taper week because they are resting, training less. I think in general, the ideal scenario is actually the opposite, because when we are responding well to training and we are going through maybe a big training block, which is typical of maybe the last blocks before the taper, before the race, good response to that kind of stimulus tends to be actually a stable or increased HRV. Also because there are physiological changes associated to increased HRV, like for example, our plasma volume might be increasing, and that is also associated to slightly lower heart rate and higher HRV. So as we do that, then we stop training, so to speak. We lower the training volume for sure, a bit of the intensity, and it's quite normal then HRV then reduces as well as we approach the race. So if we have that kind of change, typically, absolutely not worry. Do not worry. That is a good change, a typical change that we expect. In fact, if we see the opposite, that HRV increases on day per week, I would say that it means that most likely we really overcooked it in the past training blocks. So we went so far beyond that our HRV has decreased so much that we give it a break and it will increase. But that typically is not a sign that we trained well before, because typically we do not want to see our HRV decreasing and decreasing as we get through the bigger training blocks. Because again, it's an adaptive signal more than anything, so we want that to be stable or increasing. This being said, this is all considering only training. And then, of course, there's nerves, and maybe we are traveling to the other side of the world because we are racing, and then our diet is changing. Anything can happen. And I would say during that week, if you are curious, track your data, but I would say do not stress about it, because it can go any sort of ways depending on all the stresses that you face and all the changes that you're facing. For sure, your life that week is different from what is normal, what has been normal for the previous months. So that is enough to throw the reference system out of the window. And so just don't worry about it and, focus on the race and not on the data.
Maybe don't look at your watch when you wake up in a race
exactly.
morning.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Very good. Well, we've discussed training, but HRV, can it help in our general health as well? If we just look at our general health, not specifically training, does HRV track there as well? And can we do things to better our HRV?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's a difficult one to answer. In general, I would say that HRV is a good marker of our capacity to assimilate stress if we track it longitudinally in relative terms with respect to the various stressors that we face. Of course, it tracks changes in health, so to speak, meaning we can see periods in which, we are sick, we are not sick, periods in which maybe there are chronic stressors that are impacting us, and so on, periods in which maybe we have better habits in terms of sleep, exercise, diets, and periods in which we don't. So all of this is there. At the same time, I don't see it as an outcome measure reflective of our health. And as such, I wouldn't necessarily, I use the word obsess because people really obsess over these things. I wouldn't obsess over increasing it. I think that actually gets us to the opposite outcome, which is being just more stressed about it and maybe more unhealthy actually as a result of that stress. So in general, I think it's a better marker of our stress response and our capacity to assimilate stress and our adaptive capacity more than it is an absolute marker of our health. And of course, if our health could be improved with basic behaviors and habits, again, exercising, people that don't exercise or people that have a poor diet, or if our environment is not good for us, like there's sort of things that we change those and actually everything will change, right? We can do a blood panel and we will see like our values are better and, our HRV will also be better. It doesn't mean that, it is as simple as that. We could do already all the right things, and then still we have a value that with respect to the population is on the lower side. And in my opinion, that is totally fine. It doesn't mean anything negative.
Yeah. Will it be then a more balanced way to view HRV to first check in with ourselves? How are we feeling? And then if we're feeling stressed, we can check our HRV and see it may have dipped that day as a way of, well, probably I'm feeling right, I am stressed, and HRV is there to tell us, well, you're probably right.
Yeah, to me, it's a great tool to improve that self-awareness process.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
The opposite of how it is used sometimes with wearables, right? Because it's replacing self-awareness almost, because people look at it before even thinking about how they're feeling, and then basically they decide how they feel after they saw it. So I think that is a very dangerous pattern to get into. So that's also why in our app, when you wake up, you do your measurement and then you have a questionnaire and you fill in all the questions before you see your data. So at least you think about how you feel, right? So you say, okay, I slept so-and-so and I'm motivated to train and I am a bit fatigued, and you assess how you feel and then later you see the data. I think that exercise slowly gets you better also at self-awareness, which I think is the whole point of using data. And yeah, I think in that context, combining the two and looking at it that way can be helpful, but definitely not using it as a replacement for our self-awareness. And for people that get too caught into these kind of things, I think at a certain point it's better just not to look at this data, right? It's not that every tool is for every person. I think we also need to understand that. Like for some people, they have the right mental space to use it and not get too negatively impacted. Great, it's a useful tool. For other people, maybe it's better just to do it differently.
Yeah, because it can work the other way around as well. I've had a day last week that my values were absolutely fine, but I went out for a run and my legs were so heavy. I think, okay, it's not going to happen today. Just keep it easy,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I rescheduled the session. But my values were fine.
That's a
But
great
my
point,
leg,
actually.
yeah,
I
my leg
think
said
that's
something differently.
yeah, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I think the whole concept of readiness and recovery scores falls a bit apart, because they try to look at our physiology and other things, but you forget that the main limiter probably for an endurance athlete for doing anything is always muscle soreness, and muscle
Yeah,
soreness is just not captured this way. So if you don't add your own feeling to the equation and how sore you are, then it's just not going to work.
yeah. Yeah. So we can read the values, but we have to check in with ourselves as well.
Yeah,
How are we
and
feeling?
always
How did we sleep? What is the context of this value?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And always start
Yeah.
with a plan as well, I would say, right? So
Yeah.
start with a good plan, and then the data is there to make adjustments based on how you feel and how you respond to the plan. The data is not there to make up the plan entirely, because that sounds silly, but it's actually how it is used by many people. Like, they would look at the data and decide what to do. I think that doesn't work. You have to, have a plan, either make a plan or work with someone that builds your plan that is
Yeah.
already structuring the right things and giving enough time to your body to recover, hard sessions, easy sessions, and so on. And then HRV is there to make small adjustments, but it's not there to build the plan.
No, exactly. And you mentioned the app HRV for training a few times. How does that app work? It's your time to make some advertisement for HRV for training.
I appreciate it. Thanks. Well, the app is quite simple. You just take a morning measurement. You could actually pair it with some night devices, but typically, I would say my recommendation would be to measure in the morning. You can use the phone camera or you can use an external sensor. A good device to use is, of course, always a chest strap, because that is the only way to measure the electrical activity of the heart, as opposed to another proxy to that signal, which is peripherally changes in blood flow, which could be done again with a watch, a band, or a ring. But then you take your morning measurement. I would recommend shortly after waking up, after going to the toilet if you need to, sit, take your measurement, and that is a good snapshot of your resting physiology. Do that for a few days. It will learn your normal range, and then from that, it will be able to give you advice based on how your subjective data is trending as part of the questionnaire we spoke about, and how your objective data is trending, so your HRV, and then you will see it with respect to your normal range, the same for your heart rate, and you can decide then if making adjustments is a good idea or not, and that's pretty much how it works in the longer term as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Especially the questionnaire you mentioned. That's really good because it places everything into perspective.
Yeah, yeah. I have actually some coaches that tell me they don't even care about the HRV. It's just there, they use it for the for the subjective data and the questionnaire, so they get people to think about how they feel sometimes.
That's perfect. Yeah. And is there also a way to log some, also to journal something like the training, how it went or how it felt?
Yeah, so the training data, you can pull it from other devices, and then in the questionnaire there's training related questions. So how you felt you performed, how motivated you are for today's sessions. I think those things are also typically shown to be quite linked also to risk of overtraining and things like that,
Yeah.
like our motivation dipping and so on. So I think it's always useful context to interpret also the physiological data and to give you even just an opportunity to think about how things are going and potentially implement changes.
Yeah. Well, that's very valuable. You help others not to obsess about that single data point, but see it in the complete package that
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, that's perfect. Did we miss anything? Is there something you wanted to mention or discuss before we close off?
I think this was good. Yeah, I think we covered, what it is, how to measure it, how to use it, how to adjust training. So I think it was, a good shot, and I hope it's useful for people looking into this.
I'm sure it is. Well, thank you very much. Where can people find you or follow you?
I would say these days mostly on Substack. That's where I write about these topics and coaching a bit. And so that's where most of the resources are if you're interested. And of course, always feel free to comment or message me, and I'll try to help.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Marco. It was a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed this deep dive into HRV.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye bye. That's a wrap for today's episode, and thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the Aerobic Ed podcast, the best thing you can do is leave a review at Spotify or Apple Podcast. It just takes a few minutes and helps other runners to find the show. And if you want to take your training to the next level, come and talk to me. I work with recreational runners who want a structured, evidence-based approach to building real aerobic fitness. The first call is free. You'll find the link in the show notes or over at pacebodies.com. Thank you for listening and see you in the next one.